This podcast, Visceral, is a production of the GI Research Foundation. The GI Research Foundation was able to produce this podcast with sponsorships from AbbVie and Metro Infusion Centers.
And so what the bacteria are doing and these signals that they're secreting, they directly impact the health of our gastrointestinal tract and, as we're trying to study, the mental health, which is your depression and anxiety.
So I'm here today with an IBD patient who knows a little bit about what it's like to live with Crohn's disease. Dara was diagnosed when she was 17 and has been in remission for a long time, but still deals with some of the ramifications of having Crohn's disease in her daily life. And it impacts certain parts of her lifestyle, including what this episode of Visceral is all about, which is sleep. So Dara, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I'm so grateful that you want to share some of your story with us. Can you tell me a little bit about how Crohn's disease interacts with your sleep cycles?
Sure. I'm lucky because my Crohn's is pretty much in remission, controlled. So I feel lucky right now that I don't have a lot of really active symptoms. However, even when you have a chronic disease and it isn't, in a flare or an active flare, there is always this undercurrent of anxiety that sort of is always present. That, am I going to be sick? Did I eat too much? Is my disease going to sort of rear its ugly head when I least expect it? And, that has certainly happened in my life more than a handful of times. And so I think that anxiety affects sleep for sure. And listen, I'm also a mother and a human being. So I have anxiety about other things that keep me up at night. But I wouldn't say that, even having great treatment and being under the care of a great team, I do still have that sort of anxiety that does sometimes keep me up at night and does interact with my sleep cycles, because I think that, I don't know if you don't have a chronic disease, if you would really understand that, but having that sort of, is the other shoe going to drop? Like if I went to a movie and I ate a lot of popcorn and then at night I'm like, oh, what is that? That stomach pain that you would be able to dismiss if you didn't have a chronic disease. But when you have one, can really, even if the pain isn't keeping you up at night, the anxiety can.
That's so true. And that's like such an important part of this. I know that our GI psychologist, Elise Bedell talks a lot about the gut-brain connection and the way that these things interact. And then she has like a specific cycle of that anxiety and the anxiety about the anxiety can also kind of come full circle. So it's very interesting and like very something we don't always talk about, or it's very hard to parse because it's really specific to Crohn's disease and IBD in general. Has IBD ever woken you up at night?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And again, right now I feel pretty lucky because my symptoms are controlled, but as recently as maybe last year, I was having a flare where I would go to bed and then in the middle of the night wake up and have to run to the bathroom. And then of course, going back to sleep is always, it's not like you go to the bathroom for 10 minutes and then go right back to sleep. It's sort of like, then you're up for the night, which of course doesn't make you feel any better when you're in a flare. If you're missing out on sleep, it just makes you feel even sicker than the next day. And certainly I have Crohn's in my small intestine. And so I also have a lot of pain. And that has, because when you eat dinner and then 3 hours later lay down, that's sort of the time when your digestive system is hard at work, and that's when that pain can hit. And so it's really hard to fall asleep when you are dealing with cramps and pain. And I slept with a heating pad next to my bed for many years because that was one thing that gave me some relief.
Yeah, the heat. I mean, we've talked a lot about how heat taking a bath, taking a shower. Some patients have said like that's something that they do in the middle of the night. They'll like their spouse will be like, "Why are you in the shower?" And they're just like, well, because it's like helpful to kind of relax me and to kind of get me back to baseline. That's so interesting. And like you mentioned anxiety, we're talking a little bit in this episode about that connection between the mind and the body. And, do you think having IBD, how do you think IBD affects your mood?
I think I've been diagnosed for more than half of my life. So it is hard to separate myself from being someone with Crohn's disease because it has been a part of me ever since I was in high school. But I do think that having Crohn's and having a chronic illness is so interwoven in my DNA and in my personality that it is very much a part of me. I imagine that other people with chronic diseases like diabetes or, it's probably not unique to IBD, but that, it's something that I've learned to live with. And so I do think the anxiety is there, but there's also this sort of acceptance that this is what my life is. And, a gratitude for living in a time and in a place where I can have as much help as I have.
That's absolutely true. And that gratitude is, I think, part of that whole picture. Well, all right. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I think that's why it's so important to listen to patient stories and to hear more about what it's like to live with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis every chance we get, because we always learn something. And I'm so grateful to Dara for sharing her story with us. Metro Infectious Disease Consultants, the parent company of Metro Infusion Centers, is proud to announce their 30th anniversary gala celebration on October 26th in downtown Chicago. With 110 physicians and over 220 infusion centers nationwide, we are committed to making life-saving therapies available in a comfortable and cost-effective environment while continuing to support the future generations of infectious disease physicians. Please visit us at www.midcgala.com to learn how you can participate. Again, that is www.midcgala.com. Next, we talked to Dr. David Rubin and Dr. Ashley Sidebottom, leading researchers in the field who look at sleep and sleep disturbance and the way that it impacts the microbiome and the products of the microbiome, metabolites, and how all of that is related to the development and progression of IBD. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for making time to be with us today. I know that you both have so many areas of expertise, but I was hoping today that we could talk a little bit about the connections between mental health, mood, and inflammatory bowel disease, and how those two disorders or two things that can happen with our bodies are connected. Dr. Rubin, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between mood and mental health and IBD?
I sure can, Annie. So thank you for having me on this podcast. I wanted to start by just acknowledging that there's a very long history of understanding that people who suffer from Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis are at higher risk for both anxiety and depression. And the history is actually riddled with some misinterpretations and even stigma. So I thought I would start with that and then certainly hand it over to my expert colleague, Dr. Sidebottom, to explain a little bit of what we're doing to figure it out. In the history of IBD, it was well understood that people who had these chronic conditions were more likely to experience anxiety and depression. And in the earliest days, back in the 1950s, 1960s, there was actually a prevailing school of thought that it was actually a personality that gave people their IBD. And unfortunately, this led to the mistake of thinking that if you enrolled these individuals into psychotherapy, you could treat their IBD or even cure their IBD. And there was the perception that somehow the patient's personality affected them and gave them this chronic inflammatory condition. It was soon, fortunately, learned that that is incorrect, of course, and that it's understandable that people with inflammatory bowel disease have anxiety or depression or other mood disorders, but rather it wasn't that the mood disorder drove the IBD, but that they coexisted. And in some cases, we thought the IBD drove the mood disorder. There was then the perception and the belief that it was a reactive type of mood disorder. Of course, it's distressing to be diagnosed with a chronic condition at any age, let alone when you're young, and to suffer from a bowel problem in particular, which can be socially isolating and have all the other challenges that we face. But also that people who have IBD sometimes are unable to eat what they want or are fearful of eating in a social situation. And you think about all the times in our life, all the things we do where we go somewhere and it's around a table where there's food or beverages, and how much of our society revolves around social events, celebrations of any kind. And so it's understandable that someone with Crohn's or colitis might develop anxiety or depression. The challenge to this, however, is that it didn't get at the deeper understanding of what might be biological about mood disorders. In other words, is it in fact the inflammation itself or the changes of that inflammation in our body that might be driving the psychological aspects of mood changes? And so one of the unique features of what we try to do at the University of Chicago, and certainly in our Inflammatory Bowel Disease Center, is to bring together incredible scientists from across different disciplines so that we can try to answer some of these really tough questions. And that's why I'm so fortunate to be here and also so fortunate to work with people like Dr. Sidebottom.
That's wonderful. And Dr. Sidebottom, your work is really looking at the actual chemical understanding of how the microbiome influences those psychological processes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And, in particular, that the way that the gut microbiome is influencing mood and mental health in patients.
We know, as Dr. Rubin was saying, that anxiety and depression is often increased in patients with IBD. And many previous studies have proposed a relationship between what is going on in your gut and what is going on in your brain. However, the directionality of that is not well understood, which one impacts which. And what we in our study, Dr. Rubin and I, and the wonderful team here at the University of Chicago are studying, and this is through an award from GERF, we're actually studying the chemical signals that come from your gut, and they're transported through your blood, and they can cross what we call the blood-brain barrier into your brain and impact chemistries that are occurring there. And this is many different types of signals, and the types of signals that we're studying are coming from this one pathway called the tryptophan pathway. That might sound familiar. It's that compound that at Thanksgiving, everybody says if you eat, a lot of turkey, you're going to be tired. And this is because tryptophan, when you eat it in food, it is converted into this compound called melatonin. And then we all, we hear that can make us more tired. And that's a direct conversion to this compound from what you're eating. And one of these other compounds that can be made is also serotonin. And so what we're interested in is when you ingest a certain type of diet, specifically containing tryptophan, how is that changed by the gut microbiome? And if you do have an inflammatory bowel disease and you have different bacteria that are in your gut microbiome, you're actually going to have different types of metabolites leaving and different types of these signals leaving your gut, and then they pass into the brain. So we're trying to connect the dots here on what is coming from the gut and what is getting into the brain and link that back to your inflammation status and then also to your mental health status in collaboration with Dr. Elise Bedell. So we're very excited about this study. And my role is to do those measurements. So we measure from wonderful patients. We are measuring their signals from their blood here at the University of Chicago. And we can actually track what signals are in the blood. So we can link that back to how are you feeling, both in your gut and in your brain.
That's amazing. You spoke a little bit about the microbiome and metabolites. What are those terms? What does that mean? What is a metabolite and how does it relate to the microbiome?
Metabolites are small signals. They are produced by every living thing on the planet. They're inside of your cells. And in the gastrointestinal tract, we have trillions of bacteria. And we know bacteria, they don't have eyes, they don't have ears. And they use these small signals to learn about their surroundings. And we call them metabolites. So they'll use metabolites to determine if friends are nearby. They'll use metabolites to find food. And because humans have co-evolved with our bacteria that are within our gut, we know how to respond to some of these metabolites. And so what the bacteria are doing and these signals that they're secreting, they directly impact the health of our gastrointestinal tract and, as we're trying to study, the mental health, which is your depression and anxiety. I think the most well-known metabolite ever discovered, arguably, is penicillin. And just as an example, penicillin is produced by a fungus, and this fungus, for eons, has figured out how to protect itself. And it wasn't until 1928 when, Alexander Fleming found that on a petri dish, he was growing this one organism called Penicillium notatum, and he noticed that all of a sudden, this one fungus managed to defend itself against a bacteria that was on this plate. And then humans discovered penicillin, and we put it into bottles. So although Penicillium notatum was producing this metabolite into its surrounding environment to protect itself, we were able to harness that, evolutionary knowledge to, effectively change the course of treating infections. So there's thousands of these small molecules that are produced in our gastrointestinal tract all the time. We know some of them, we don't know some of them, and they're very challenging to study. And so that is what Dr. Rubin and I are very interested in determining, is what are these metabolites, and specifically for the tryptophan metabolite, what is the impact of the gut microbiome on the metabolite pool?
That's just so fascinating. You'll have to forgive me for asking for your dissertation, but we don't always get to talk to chemists. So it's very interesting to hear some of that background information. We talk to clinicians all the time. I don't get to talk to a trained chemist that often. And to hear, it's really fascinating to hear some of the mechanisms behind that work. This episode is brought to you by AbbVie. AbbVie's mission is to discover and deliver innovative medicines that solve serious health issues today and address the medical challenges of tomorrow. We strive to have a remarkable impact on people's lives across several key therapeutic areas. For more information about AbbVie, please visit us at www.abbvie.com. Follow AbbVie on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Dr. Rubin, turning to you, of course, can you tell me a little bit more about what those conversations are like with patients and helping them to understand some of these biological mechanisms when they've been told, and when we understand, to me, I'm curious to know how you tease out the things that we do know that impact conventional understandings of depression and anxiety, and now this new information, and what those conversations are like, and then what other aspects of patients' lives are impacted by this research.
Yeah, well, let me first start by acknowledging how incredible it is to work at a university where we have these scientists literally across the street, who are not only amazing at what they do, they're engaged in the clinical enterprise with us. So when we say we want to figure out the biological basis for mood disorders in people who have chronic inflammation of their gut, they say, that sounds really interesting. Here are some different tools we have. How can we apply these together? In order to do a scientific project like this, it requires, first of all, of course, a meaningful clinical question. Question here is, how often does this happen? How can we explain it better? And then ultimately, of course, how do you treat it more effectively? The second thing, of course, then becomes the actual mechanics of how do you do a research study in the clinic with patients who have these problems, and of course, a control group of patients who may not have these problems. And then the third part, of course, is where does it go from here? We can do lots of projects that have interesting results that don't change our practice. We've focused on screening patients for mental health disorders for quite some time. I was involved in developing guidelines for the management of inflammatory bowel disease, and specifically ulcerative colitis. In 2019, we published and said that patients with IBD should be screened for anxiety and depression, and they should be offered treatments when that was identified. Now, it's easy to say that, but the reality is putting that into practice becomes a challenge. So there are many pieces to doing this project. And they start with even the health services delivery issue of how do you actually screen people in clinic, all the way down to the basic and translational questions of what metabolites might be driving some of these problems. And then it bounces right back to the clinic where we say, okay, now that we've discovered some of these things, how are we going to change what we do? So I want to emphasize what was mentioned by Dr. Sidebottom is that we're also very fortunate to work with a gastropsychologist, Dr. Elise Bedell, who's been on the podcast and who I want to highlight is an incredible resource for us to guide us on some of this. And we've been screening patients in my inflammatory bowel disease clinic, and we're expanding it across all of our IBD clinics to understand how often does this even happen? How often are patients walking around with Crohn's or colitis, even when they're in remission, but have coexisting anxiety and depression, and as mentioned, sleep disorders. And by identifying who these people are and then looking for these signals, we're going to be able to figure some things out. One of the findings that we've already identified is that there's a large number of people who screen positive even for mild anxiety or depression using standard survey instruments that have been validated. And we've also identified that even people who have been told previously that they suffer from anxiety or depression, they tell us that, they still screen positive. In other words, they're not necessarily being treated effectively. So even before we get to the metabolites and understanding mechanism, we're identifying a huge unmet need in our own patients that we want to address. We've also demonstrated, and others have shown this, that the more inflammation somebody has, the more likely they are to have anxiety and depression. Now, that may sound really obvious to the audience in the sense that, of course, when you're inflamed and having more bowel movements and having abdominal pain, you might have more depression and anxiety. But it gives us a clue to think about how we might study those individuals to really look for the signals that Dr. Sidebottom is doing. If we are right, if our hypothesis that a disrupted microbiome or chronic inflammation or both are driving neurotransmitter imbalances that are contributing to mood disorders, it would imply that if we restore the inflamed bowel to its normal state, or we turn off the inflammation, people's mood disorders and we think sleep would improve. It would also imply that that could be a treatment for those mood disorders rather than some of the therapies that are being provided. And I want to highlight for you the other piece to this, which is that it may also suggest it's bidirectional. Maybe therapy and other approaches to treating mood disorders can drive improvements in inflammation. So there's a huge amount of different ways we can go with this, and it's a really important priority for us. And as I'm sure people understand who are listening, patients are really appreciating that we're trying to study this.
And I know that I can speak to that the support group that we lead every month, I mean, the vast majority of people are struggling with a mood disorder of some kind and the sleep disturbances that you speak of, as well as just other things that probably are related to metabolism like fatigue and other ongoing symptoms. So this is so needed and so important. And I wish it's so interesting whenever we have these conversations, I'm always wishing that I could magically pull in our dietitians and our GI psychologists, because it's also just so clear in these conversations how this is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary problem that requires so much input from so many different kinds of experts. And when you say bidirectional, what does that mean? Because I think that might not be something that we all understand, but I think that might speak to the complexity of the problem. Could you speak a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, it's a very important question, and I also want to touch on sleep a little more. One is the bidirectional term means that it may be that the inflamed bowel and changes in that gut microbiome, all those organisms that live in our intestines, may in fact be affecting the metabolism, the breaking down of the things we eat and the amino acids that are parts of proteins that are what we eat, and resulting in an imbalanced neurotransmitter system in our body. And work in Italy has actually shown that in addition to some of those signals that we're starting to clarify, when your bowel is inflamed, very importantly and interestingly, the barrier between what's circulating in your bloodstream and what gets into your brain actually becomes leaky. So you have this combination of both a leaky blood-brain barrier and a disruption of the gut microbiome or the balance of the metabolism of the things we eat and the different types of breakdowns within our system. And we think that that's unfortunately, that perfect storm that leads to people having mood disorders. And the other piece to this, the other direction that makes it bidirectional, is that we also think that it's possible that those signals in the neurotransmitters, elevated serotonin levels or reduced dopamine levels, may in fact be affecting the microbiome or affecting the bowel in terms of its response to inflammation. So what I'm suggesting here is that we don't necessarily know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but by identifying these associations, it gives us a model so that we can start studying causality and look at the directionality of it so we could treat it more effectively. I suspect it's going to be more based on the inflamed bowel. In other words, treating the inflamed bowel will result in improvements in all these other things. But it might also work the other direction, and I think that's a really important point. Now, when it comes to sleep, I did want to highlight that we've studied here, and this has been work in my lab for years, that people with inflammatory bowel disease do not have normal sleep patterns when they're inflamed. And we did a unique study years ago where we had people who were in remission. They felt fine from their ulcerative colitis. They didn't have any active symptoms. They were doing okay. And they were scheduled for a routine colonoscopy for cancer screening and prevention. And the week before they came for that colonoscopy, we had them wear a actigraphy watch. That's a watch that measures how you sleep. Now, those are built into a lot of the things we wear these days, like Apple Watches or Fitbits. But back then, this was dedicated just to measuring your sleep patterns. And what we found really interestingly was that the patients who felt fine, but who, when we put the scope in, had inflammation of their bowel, which happens 30 to 50% of the time, actually, were people who actually had disrupted sleep, or they didn't get to the restful and restorative sleep that we call REM sleep. And I'm sure many people have heard of REM sleep. REM sleep is when you dream, and REM sleep is when we think your body is restoring itself and refurbishing itself. So if you don't get to REM sleep, you may sleep 8 hours, but you're never getting that restful sleep. So you wake up feeling fatigued and tired. And fatigue is a very common problem in IBD. So what we learned is that your sleep pattern could predict that there was actually inflammation in your bowel, even when you didn't feel it. And so that gets back to this other question. So you heard Dr. Sidebottom mention that melatonin is another metabolite that we're measuring and is related to some of these same pathways. And we believe that we're going to identify melatonin disruption that is related to inflammation. Now, some may be saying, why didn't they do this years ago? Well, the reality is that the technology is truly advanced. Dr. Sidebottom's leading the world in some of this. And also, we've even developed some new ways to get the blood samples. We don't have to draw your blood through your vein. We actually can do finger sticks now on little filter papers in clinic. It takes literally 30 seconds. And then we get samples that can be stored in the freezer until we're ready to run them through a very sophisticated machine that Dr. Sidebottom uses, and which the GI Research Foundation has funded us purchasing a second one because this work is going so well.
It's amazing. That's so incredible. Dr. Sidebottom, what is the future direction for some of this work, and what are you thinking of as your next vista that you'll get to explore?
It's very exciting work, and it's only going to open more doors. In the mental health space specifically, as Dr. Rubin was saying, our ability to now collect blood in clinic is kind of revolutionizing how we're approaching this study. Prior to this, we needed a full blood draw, or we needed a stool sample, or possibly urine, which is a lot harder to obtain. So I think that applying this to the patients as they come into the clinic and making it part of standard care to capture patients as they go through treatment, so not just at one single visit, but along their entire course of treatment, or if they're early on in their disease. And if we are able to do that, we'll be able to catch patients longitudinally, so we can maybe predict when certain things need to change, or we can anticipate that something might need to be altered either clinically or possibly with Dr. Bedell. So I see the future of this as part of standard of care, and from that, we'll be able to learn more in-depth information about every patient specific to IBD and specific to their treatment course.
That really brings up a wonderful point, which is that patients listening, or colleagues and friends of ours who are listening, might say, oh my gosh, I want to know what my metabolites are. And it's not something where we just draw your blood and send it off to the lab as a routine measure. And in fact, we're measuring over 300 metabolites in every one of our patients. We have some very specific questions we're looking at, But the point is, we may identify some novel signals as well. And ultimately, of course, it would be of great interest if we could develop a diagnostic test that would give us a clue as to the driving force of people's mood and mental health and sleep problems. So we're working on all of that, and we hope that the people listening will get engaged. And we, of course, value their insights as patients who are obviously stakeholders in all this, but we also need their support. So that's why we're grateful to the GI Research Foundation.
Oh, thank you both so much. This has been so illuminating and is such a different world than the stories that I hear from our patients who've been struggling with this for such a long time. And I'm just so grateful to both of you for your contributions. And thank you for joining us today on Visceral. And I look forward to talking to both of you again soon.
Thank you so much, Annie. It was great to be here.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast Visceral from the GI Research Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Anna Gomberg, and edited and mixed by the incredible Mike Collins-Dowden, who also composed our theme music. We hope you will join us next time. Until then, to access other podcasts and learn more about research to treat, prevent, and cure digestive diseases, as well as access additional educational materials, please visit the website at giresearchfoundation.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you again to our sponsors, AbbVie and Metro Infusion Centers.